I don't know if which one I would choose.
Everyone wants to know what was said inside that private meeting, but sometimes the more important question is why that meeting needed to happen at all. That is where the story surrounding Carlos Alcaraz becomes much more interesting. At 23, Carlos Alcaraz finally reveals the truth behind that private meeting, shedding more light on a conversation that had remained largely outside public view. Yet the truth is not built around one dramatic sentence. It comes from understanding the circumstances around him, the decisions being considered, and the details that make that private meeting meaningful when viewed as part of the larger picture. Instead of chasing rumors about what happened behind closed doors, we are going to follow the evidence surrounding the meeting and work toward the truth piece by piece. This is the story of why the conversation mattered, what Alcaraz has revealed about it, and what fans may have misunderstood about the situation from the beginning. Subscribe for tennis stories that go beyond the headline. The place to begin is the end of the 2025 season, because almost nothing about Carlos Alcaraz's results suggested that a major change was coming. He had just completed one of the strongest years of his career. He won 8 tour-level titles, captured Roland Garros and the US Open, and finished the season as the year-end world number 1. From the outside, the partnership with Juan Carlos Ferrero looked secure. Success was not disappearing. The player was not sliding down the rankings. Their work was still producing major trophies. That made the events that followed much harder to understand. Alcaraz had been working with Ferrero since he was 15. Their relationship began long before packed stadiums treated Carlos like a global superstar. Ferrero had already experienced the top of professional tennis himself. He had reached world number 1 as a player and won Roland Garros in 2003. When he began guiding Alcaraz, the teenager possessed extraordinary raw ability, but had none of the major titles that would later define him. 7 years changed everything. Under Ferrero's guidance, Alcaraz developed into a champion on every major surface. He won his first Grand Slam at the 2022 US Open and became the youngest world number 1 in ATP rankings history at 19. Wimbledon followed in 2023. He successfully defended that title the next year, while also winning Roland Garros for the first time. During 2025, another Roland Garros crown and a second US Open title increased his major collection to 6. By the end of their partnership, Alcaraz had collected 24 tour-level trophies while working with Ferrero. That history matters because it explains why a normal coaching change never really described what happened. Ferrero had entered the picture while Carlos was still developing. His role had stretched beyond tactical advice given during tournaments. The partnership covered the years in which Alcaraz went from a promising Spanish teenager to the leading player in men's tennis. Then, December 17, 2025 arrived. Alcaraz announced that the relationship was ending. His public message was affectionate. There was no attack on Ferrero. No accusation appeared. Instead, Carlos thanked the man who had helped turn his childhood ambitions into reality. He described their journey with warmth and said they had reached the place toward which they had worked. One phrase carried particular importance. Alcaraz presented the separation as something that he and Ferrero had decided together. At first, that wording offered a simple explanation. A long partnership had reached its natural end. 2 successful people were moving toward separate projects. Their personal relationship remained intact, while the professional chapter had closed. Ferrero's response made the picture more complicated. His farewell also contained enormous respect for Carlos, yet one detail immediately stood out. Ferrero said he wished he could have continued. That sentence did not prove that somebody had forced Alcaraz to remove him. It did not establish a family plot or an explosive argument. What it did establish was that Ferrero had not entered the situation wanting the coaching relationship to finish. Suddenly, the idea of a completely straightforward mutual ending required a closer look. Ferrero gave that closer look days later. Speaking publicly after the split, he described himself as hurt. His emotional reaction made sense considering the length of the partnership. He said he had poured himself into the project and needed time to process the separation. More importantly, for understanding the private discussions, Ferrero explained that the relationship between him and Alcaraz during the season had remained very good. There had not been some constant series of arguments between player and coach. According to Ferrero, when the season finished in Turin, the expectation inside the group was that they would continue together. That detail changes the timeline. If both sides had entered the final weeks of 2025 expecting another season together, the break was not simply the result of a plan made months earlier. Something changed while the future terms of the partnership were being discussed. Contract negotiations became central to the story. Ferrero later explained that disagreement developed around the conditions for continuing the relationship. Reports describe negotiations in which several points could not be resolved. Ferrero rejected the idea that money alone explained the outcome. His position was that the problem involved broader terms and a different view of how the partnership should continue. He was also clear about something involving Carlos personally. Ferrero said he had spoken with Alcaraz beforehand to make sure the player knew what was being discussed. Carlos told him that he was aware. That exchange is one of the most useful facts for understanding what happened away from public view. Alcaraz was not presented by Ferrero as somebody who had no idea negotiations were taking place. Ferrero did not describe Carlos as being secretly removed from the process. His account was that the player understood the terms being discussed. Once Ferrero knew that, he dealt with the people responsible for handling the negotiations. That distinction matters. A professional athlete at Alcaraz's level does not operate alone. Coaches, agents, family members, fitness specialists, and other trusted people can become part of decisions that affect an entire career. The final choice still affects the player more than anyone else, but the discussion surrounding it often involves several voices. For Alcaraz, that structure had become especially important because his team was already evolving before Ferrero left. Samuel Lopez joined the coaching group in December 2024. He was not brought in after the split as an emergency replacement. Lopez already knew Ferrero well and had extensive coaching experience of his own. During 2025, his presence allowed responsibilities around Alcaraz to be shared. Ferrero later spoke positively about that addition. Rather than treating Lopez as a threat, he said Samuel had brought fresh air into the group. Ferrero believed the extra support could help the partnership with Carlos last longer. That makes another popular explanation difficult to support. There is no solid evidence that the split began because Lopez arrived and pushed Ferrero out. The transition became easier because Lopez was already there, but that is different from saying he caused it. By December 2025, the important argument was about the conditions under which Ferrero would continue. This is where the private side of the story becomes more revealing than any dramatic rumor. The people involved did not later describe a huge personal betrayal. They described a failure to reach an agreement. Ferrero said the relationship with Carlos had been excellent during the year. He also made clear that disagreement over certain points did not destroy their friendship. Months later, when he discussed the subject again, his explanation remained focused on different ideas about how to move forward and the terms attached to continuing. There was still another layer, however, because coaching Alcaraz had never been purely about contracts. Ferrero and Carlos did not always share the same philosophy. That difference had already been visible before their professional separation. The Netflix documentary about Alcaraz showed some of the tension between the structure preferred by his coaching team and Carlos's desire to enjoy life away from competition. Alcaraz has never hidden the fact that enjoyment matters to him. His view of professional success does not require turning every hour of his life into tennis. He has spoken about needing time with friends and family. Trips after tournaments have sometimes become part of that conversation. For Carlos, mental freshness and happiness have been connected to how well he performs when he returns to competition. Ferrero came from a stricter coaching perspective. His concern was not that Carlos lacked talent. Nobody who worked that closely with Alcaraz could seriously question his ability. The issue was how much discipline would be needed over many years if the goal became competing for a place among the greatest players ever. That is a much more subtle disagreement than a simple fight. A coach can care deeply about a player while still believing the player should make different choices. The athlete can respect the coach while deciding that his own career needs another balance. Neither position automatically creates a villain. Ferrero later admitted that he sometimes told Carlos no too often. He described Alcaraz as being almost like family during their years together, which helps explain both the strictness and the emotion that followed the separation. The documentary had included Ferrero questioning whether Alcaraz's understanding of work and sacrifice would allow him to become the greatest in history. After the split, Ferrero did not pretend he had never held that concern. He also acknowledged that a coach must adapt to the player in front of him. By 2026, he could see Carlos testing his own approach without him. Before that test truly began, Alcaraz had to answer questions. His first major tournament without Ferrero was the Australian Open in January 2026. The coaching split followed him into Melbourne because reporters naturally wanted a clearer reason for one of the biggest changes of the offseason. Alcaraz remained careful. He described the separation as something decided internally. He spoke of chapters in life reaching their end and maintained that the decision had been handled within the group. Those comments did not reveal every contractual clause discussed in December. They did reveal how Carlos wanted the decision understood. He was not publicly presenting himself as a victim of his entourage. He did not blame Ferrero. He did not say a personal argument had destroyed the partnership. Instead, he accepted the outcome as an internal decision and moved forward with the people who remained around him. His description of the new setup was surprisingly simple. According to Alcaraz, he essentially had the same team with one person missing. Calling Ferrero merely one missing member sounded almost understated considering his importance. Yet the larger point was clear. Carlos had not demolished the entire system that helped build his career. The fitness staff remained. Familiar support figures stayed. Samuel Lopez moved into the leading coaching role after already spending the previous season inside the group. Even the training routine remained largely familiar. Alcaraz said preseason work had continued without major changes to the basic structure. Lopez naturally had his own ideas, but he already understood the player and the methods used around him. That provides another piece of evidence about those internal discussions. Whatever disagreement ended the Ferrero partnership, Alcaraz was not rejecting everything Ferrero had helped create. If he had wanted a complete philosophical revolution, keeping so much of the existing team would have been a strange way to start one. Instead, the transition looked selective. One enormously important relationship ended. The wider structure survived. The next question was unavoidable. Would it work? Australian Open pressure made the answer arrive quickly. Before 2026, Melbourne had been the only Grand Slam where Alcaraz had never reached the semi-finals. His best results had been quarterfinal appearances. Winning the title would complete his career Grand Slam, meaning he would have captured all 4 major championships at least once. Trying to achieve that milestone without Ferrero created an obvious test. Some former players wondered how the separation would affect Carlos psychologically. Ferrero had been beside him during every one of his first 6 Grand Slam victories. Their communication had been built over years of practice sessions, difficult defeats, and major finals. Alcaraz entered Melbourne with Samuel Lopez leading the coaching setup. He left as champion. In the final, Carlos defeated Novak Djokovic in 4 sets and became the youngest man to complete the career Grand Slam. The Australian Open trophy was his 7th major title, but it carried a different meaning from the first 6. This one arrived without Ferrero, sitting in his box. The result did not prove that Ferrero had been unnecessary. That would ignore 7 years of development and everything Alcaraz himself continued to credit to his former coach. It proved something narrower. The structure around Carlos could function after the separation. Alcaraz himself understood how much attention had been placed on that question. After winning the title, he spoke about proving doubters wrong. He emphasized the work completed during preseason and the trust he had in his team. The timing was significant because the Australian Open came only weeks after so many people wondered whether changing coaches could destabilize him. Instead of starting 2026 with visible confusion, Alcaraz produced the result that had escaped him throughout his previous visits to Melbourne. Soon afterward, he won again in Doha. Ferrero was watching from a distance. His reaction to the separation had remained emotional, although the connection between the two men was not completely broken. Ferrero later said he had written to Carlos after the Australian Open. Another message followed after Doha. He also communicated with members of the team. Those contacts are difficult to fit into a story about personal hatred. Distance existed. Pain existed on Ferrero's side. Their daily professional connection had ended. Yet communication had not disappeared. By March, Ferrero was speaking even more openly about his feelings. He explained that seeing Alcaraz compete without him was complicated. Part of him wanted Carlos to succeed because affection remained. Another part felt the absence created by no longer being inside the team. That emotional conflict tells us something important about why the December negotiations became so sensitive. This had not been an ordinary employment arrangement. Ferrero had coached Alcaraz from adolescence into global fame. They had experienced the first world #1 ranking together. 6 Grand Slam victories came during their partnership. Countless weeks were spent training, traveling, and preparing away from cameras. Contract negotiations were therefore deciding the future of a relationship, carrying much more history than numbers on a page. Ferrero later described the cause of the split in relatively plain terms. They had not agreed on how to continue under the same conditions. He rejected the idea that something terrible had happened personally. That statement is crucial because sensational versions of the story often need a dramatic enemy. Somebody has to betray somebody else. A secret fight must be imagined. Family members are assigned motives that they have never publicly confirmed. The documented version is less theatrical, but more revealing. A highly successful partnership reached negotiations over its next phase. Different views existed, terms could not be aligned. Alcaraz knew what was being discussed. His wider circle participated in the process. Ferrero chose not to continue under conditions he did not agree with, while Carlos accepted the direction taken by the people around him and moved forward. Family involvement also needs to be handled carefully. Ferrero acknowledged that important decisions naturally get discussed with family. When asked whether Alcaraz's family influenced the outcome, he indicated that there had been some influence. That does not prove Carlos's father secretly fired Ferrero. It does not prove the player had no control. Alcaraz publicly treated the outcome as an internal decision in which he stood behind the final choice. Ferrero also said he had checked whether Carlos knew the terms being discussed, and Carlos confirmed that he did. Those two accounts give the player agency. They also show why describing the situation as only Carlos versus Ferrero misses the way elite tennis teams actually operate. At 22, Alcaraz was already running a career worth millions and carrying expectations that stretched far beyond the next tournament. Professional decisions affected training locations, travel, coaching responsibilities, scheduling, and long-term development. People trusted by the player had roles in those conversations. The private discussions were therefore about more than whether Carlos liked his coach. Evidence strongly suggests he did. Ferrero repeatedly described their personal relationship in positive terms. Alcaraz publicly expressed gratitude. Even after the split, neither man launched a personal attack on the other. What had changed was their ability to agree on the next professional stage. Months later, Ferrero still spoke about wanting a proper face-to-face conversation with Carlos. He said he would like to see him, hug him, and normalize what had happened. There was even talk of having coffee together and perhaps playing golf. That is a revealing detail. If December had ended with complete personal closure, such a conversation would hardly feel unfinished. Ferrero clearly believed there were emotions that had not been fully settled between them. He also refused to permanently close the door on coaching Alcaraz again. Asked about a possible future reunion, Ferrero left the possibility open. At one point, he even said that if Carlos asked him to return, he would struggle to say no. That does not mean a reunion is planned. There has been no confirmed announcement putting the partnership back together. It simply shows how Ferrero distinguishes the failed professional agreement from his feelings toward the player. By June, his public comments still carried that mixture of distance and affection. Ferrero said he did not speak often with Alcaraz, although they had communicated after major moments and during Carlos's injury period. He explained that both needed space to begin a new stage. That choice of distance makes sense. Watching someone continue a journey you helped build can be emotionally difficult, especially when the separation was not the outcome you originally wanted. For Alcaraz, the responsibility shifted in another direction. Without Ferrero, every success could be used as proof that the change worked. Every poor result could be turned into evidence that the split had been a mistake. That kind of judgment is too simple. Tennis careers cannot be measured by one tournament after a coaching change. Ferrero's influence did not disappear when his name vanished from the coaching box. Years of habits, tactical lessons, and professional experience remained inside the player. Samuel Lopez also inherited a foundation he already knew well. The transition, therefore, contained continuity alongside change. Carlos became responsible for shaping his career with greater independence. Ferrero had to accept that the player he helped develop had reached a stage where the relationship no longer operated under the same framework. This is where their earlier differences over lifestyle and discipline become relevant, without needing to exaggerate them. Carlos has always projected joy on court. His creativity often looks spontaneous. He plays points that seem almost impossible to plan. Off court, he has repeatedly spoken about protecting the happiness that allows him to compete with that freedom. Ferrero's job was different. A coach thinks about repetition, preparation, and the cost of small habits over an entire season. He had already lived the professional tour as a #1 player himself. His instinct naturally leaned toward protecting the standards required to survive at the top. Those perspectives worked together for years. Eventually, agreement over the next stage could not be reached. That is a far more believable explanation for the end of such a successful partnership than assuming 7 years were destroyed by one sudden argument. The December negotiations became the point where deeper differences had to be converted into actual professional terms. When that process failed, the partnership ended. No verified public account gives us every sentence spoken behind closed doors. Alcaraz has not released a transcript of the discussions. Ferrero has never claimed to provide one either. Pretending otherwise would turn unanswered questions into invented facts. What the two men have revealed gives us something more useful. Carlos knew the situation being discussed. Ferrero expected the partnership to continue when the 2025 season ended. Negotiations later failed. Money was not presented by Ferrero as the only decisive problem. Different ideas existed about how their work should move forward. The wider Alcaraz team participated in the process. Personal respect survived even after the professional agreement collapsed. That is the actual shape of the story. The years that came before explain why it hurt. The first months afterward explain why Carlos accepted the risk. Alcaraz entered the new era without replacing every person around him. Samuel Lopez already understood the system. Training continued with familiar foundations. The Australian Open then produced the strongest possible start to life without Ferrero. None of that erases the former coach. Carlos has never tried to erase him. When Alcaraz spoke about the change in Melbourne, he credited Ferrero for helping make him the player he had become. That gratitude fits with his original farewell and with the history they created together. The separation was not a denial of those years. It was a decision about what came next. Now Alcaraz is 23 and his career has entered a stage Ferrero spent years preparing him to reach. He already owns all 4 Grand Slam titles across his career. He has been world #1. His biggest future challenge is no longer proving that he belongs at the top level. Longevity has become the harder question. That makes the philosophy behind those private discussions even more interesting. Ferrero worried about the demands required to remain great for many years. Carlos believed his own balance between intense work and a life outside tennis could still deliver extraordinary results. Neither side can settle that argument with a few months of evidence. Australian Open success showed that Carlos could win a major immediately after the coaching change. His longer career will reveal whether the approach he has chosen remains sustainable through injuries, pressure, rivalries, and the physical demands of the tour. The current situation also adds perspective. During 2026, Alcaraz has had to deal with a significant wrist problem that kept him away from competition for months and forced him to miss major events. Those circumstances are not evidence that the Ferrero split caused his injury. There is no factual basis for making that connection. They do show how quickly a young champion's environment can be tested. When a player is healthy and winning, every system looks strong. Difficult periods reveal whether communication and trust can survive uncertainty. Samuel Lopez and the rest of the team now carry that responsibility with Carlos. Ferrero watches from somewhere else. Even so, the old relationship has never completely disappeared from the story because so much of Alcaraz's tennis identity was built during those 7 years. The most revealing part of the private process is therefore not some explosive sentence that nobody heard. It is the fact that success itself was not enough to guarantee continuation. Alcaraz and Ferrero had just completed an outstanding season. Their partnership had produced 6 Grand Slam titles. Their relationship remained personally close. Still, they reached a point where agreeing on the future became more important than protecting the appearance of stability. Carlos accepted change. Ferrero accepted separation, even though he would have preferred another outcome. Samuel Lopez stepped forward. Then the player had to live with the consequences. That sequence gives the meeting and the negotiations surrounding it their real significance. They marked the moment when Carlos Alcaraz stopped being only the brilliant young champion, developed inside Ferrero's structure, and began carrying greater ownership of what his professional life would look like without the coach who had guided him since he was 15. There was no confirmed betrayal hidden inside the room. There was no verified secret feud that suddenly destroyed everything. The available evidence points towards something more complicated. Different visions reaching a point where professional terms could no longer keep them together. Perhaps that is why the story stayed mysterious for so long. Fans expected a reason dramatic enough to match the shock of the announcement. The people involved kept describing a quieter reality. 7 years of success had created a relationship strong enough to survive personally, but not a professional agreement strong enough to continue under terms both sides could accept. At 23, Alcaraz now lives with that decision every time he walks onto court without Ferrero beside him. His Australian Open triumph showed what independence could look like at its best. The difficult periods that follow will test the same choice from another direction. Ferrero's own words leave one final possibility hanging in the background. The door between them is not locked. There is affection on both sides of the history. Ferrero has spoken about wanting a proper reunion away from the pressure surrounding their split. He has left open the possibility that their professional paths could cross again someday. Whether that ever happens is unknown. For now, their shared chapter remains finished. What happened behind closed doors was not the collapse of respect, it was the end of agreement. And once that distinction becomes clear, the private meeting stops looking like a hidden scandal and starts looking like one of the most important career decisions Carlos Alcaraz has faced, choosing how he wanted the next stage of his tennis life to be built. The trophies that came before were created with Ferrero. The responsibility for what follows belongs increasingly to Alcaraz himself. That is why this story will not truly be judged by one conversation in December or even one brilliant tournament afterward. Its meaning will become clearer as Carlos moves deeper into his 20s and the choices made inside that room are measured against the career that follows. If Alcaraz continues building history on his own terms, those discussions will eventually look like the difficult moment when a young champion decided he was ready for greater control. If he ever chooses to work with Ferrero again, their separation will instead become an unusual pause inside one of tennis's most successful coaching relationships. For now, only the first part of that answer exists. Carlos has already shown that he can win without the coach who helped raise him to the top. Ferrero has shown that disappointment did not erase his affection for the player. Their public explanations have stripped away much of the noise surrounding the split, while leaving some private details exactly where both men appear to want them: private. And perhaps that is the clearest truth behind the entire meeting. Not every important decision produces a villain. Sometimes two people who achieved almost everything together reach a point where they no longer agree on how the next part should work. Carlos Alcaraz chose to move forward. Juan Carlos Ferrero stepped away. The history they created remains untouched, while the consequences of their final private discussions are still being written on court. If you think Alcaraz made the right decision by beginning this new chapter without Ferrero, tell us why in the comments. And if you believe the two should eventually reunite, let us know what would need to change first. Subscribe for more tennis stories where we separate what is actually known from everything surrounding the headline, and turn on notifications so you do not miss what happens next in Carlos Alcaraz's career.